All right, welcome everyone. Today we have kind of a different video. This is going to be kind of more a discussion, not quite a debate. I posted on my Instagram basically asking, or rather inviting, any SSPX supporter to have a conversation. And Anthony reached out very enthusiastically and willingly. Really appreciate you coming on. Anthony, you want to give a quick plug? I know you have an Instagram, but you also have a YouTube channel. Is that correct?
Yes, sir. Yeah. So first off, Seth, thank you for having me on. I do
Mhm.
appreciate it. Yeah, I saw the post. Wanted to talk about the SSPX. It's obviously kind of a there's a hot button like lens to look through things there. Yeah.
Mhm.
So Tradtards, right? We have our Instagram at Tradtards. We also have a Telegram and a YouTube. It's self-referential, right? For anyone that's curious about the name. So I'm totally casting any aspersions about my mental ability on myself. And also, from a trad perspective there. But we mainly talk about Catholic culture and social
Mhm.
commentary. So that's the quick blurb on me. As Seth said, yes, I would consider myself a supporter of the society. I don't attend their chapels exclusively. I have in the past,
Mhm.
especially when abroad. That's where their presence is really big. But I know today that we did kind of want to discuss the Novus Ordo through the
Mhm.
lens of the SSPX, and I'm very happy and excited to be here. Thanks once again, Seth.
Yeah, of course. So I guess the first thing I would want to do is kind of establish, do you take the exact view that the SSPX takes regarding the Novus Order, or is your view slightly different, maybe?
So, from to make sure that we're on the same page there, they understand, as most people do, right, that there's no question about the validity of the
Hmm.
Novus Ordo Mass, and this is something that, at least in all the literature I've read of the society, they're pretty clear on. Yes, they do in fact believe that the new Mass, the Mass of Paul VI, Novus Ordo, whatever you want to call it, right, the Mass that most people
Hmm.
have probably seen, grown up with since 1970, they do think it is valid. However, when
Hmm.
it comes to the question of whether it is fitting, whether it has a Catholic nature,
Hmm.
right? These are topics of debate within the society. These are sometimes topics of debate I think that probably aren't really talked about outside of the trad sphere, as it were. But I think if I were to pick probably my main source for trying to find what's pretty close to a society argument, obviously you can read Lefebvre writes at length about it. There's some of the other society bishops and priests that have a lot to write about what they think of the new liturgy and how they think it is sufficient. I'd say Dr. Pierre Kwasniewski probably does a pretty good job in a lot of his books. He's not necessarily SSPX. He's very just focused on the liturgy. Obviously, he does address, um, the society's argument and mission, but he also makes a lot of arguments that are kind of in the same vein as the society. And
Hmm.
I do know that he definitely sympathizes with the society's mission, and also
Right.
he has written a
Yeah.
lot about Archbishop Lefebvre as well. So yeah, I mean, I would generally like, here's the thing about the Novus Ordo, and I'm certain that you're aware of this too. There's a big range, right, of what you can
Yeah.
see the new mass expressed in. I do think that there's some glaring things, and the only reason I'm using Peter Kay as an example because he's frankly he's kind of like the if you were to pick a laureate for our side on the trad side, as it were, for if there is a side there, right? He's
Hmm.
probably the best at writing it down, putting it into literature.
Sure.
And
Sure.
he talks about there was some pretty big changes from obviously the missile as it was. If you really want to get back to it, pre 1954 version of the Tridentine Rite, as some would call it, Mass of Saint
Hmm.
Pius V. And so obviously the Latin language, right, which is a small but kind of a crucial part. That's what they would say. That's what the argument is. Also to just entire changes to parts of the Mass and
Hmm.
complete just things that are gone, right? Last gospel being
Right.
gone. Some of those prayers, the prayers at the foot of the altar,
Hmm.
just taking out entire psalms and whatnot. And also to just, there's a lot that went into the mass that was taken out. Obviously, the main thing about the Novus Ordo, it's not, and the argument is not what it allowed to, it's not what it explicitly took out, but it was all the things that were kind of taken for granted in total that
Hmm.
just now it was like it's a matter of what parish you go to. Are you going to find those things? Are you going to find an altar rail, right? Are you going to find certain type of vestments, right? Are you going to find certain prayers in the mass? Obviously there's a big change that happened with the yearly readings, right, going from one cycle calendar to three. And there's the whole argument there, oh, we get more of the Bible, right? That's a whole nother can of worms. But there
Hmm.
was a definite change to the nature of the Catholic substance of the Mass. And that's the society's argument, right? I
Mhm.
tend to agree with it for the most part. I think there was a massive change. And I think anyone that's probably gone to a Latin Mass would say there's a difference. But then
Mhm.
the argument becomes, okay, what does that mean? Um, I,
Mhm.
I've talked for, I don't even know how long
Yeah,
that was,
let
but
me
I want
jump in
to,
here and just yeah, let me
yeah,
just
no
jump in
problem.
here.
Of course.
Because if we're talking about differences, obviously there's a difference. Anyone who says it's like not different is kind of being naive. Personally, I do actually prefer the Latin Mass. I go to that pretty much exclusively, not based on principle, just based on preference. So I totally get the argument for why you
Mhm.
can say one is even. I think you could even argue that one is maybe even better than the other. I think you could say that you could make that argument. What I'm interested in, because the SSPX takes very strong views on this, right? So they use terms like objectively sacrilegious. They say it's insulting to God, that it's never permitted to attend. Obviously, like culpability, whatever. But if you know about it
Yeah.
and you attend, it's a sin. Do you go that far on the Novus Ordo?
Uh, I personally probably would not. My whole thing is
Okay,
like the society, they do a lot to try to get into areas where there's absolutely no option of a Latin mass or even a more
sure.
traditional liturgy, right?
Hmm.
And definitely, I do know, like, society priests, the leadership, yeah, is very strong. Like, don't go
Hmm.
to the Novus Ordo if you can help it, right? And even, I mean, I've even heard Peter Kay like make a similar argument. Like, I've been to talks of his, I've met him in person a few
Yeah.
times. I'm
Well,
a
they
huge fan of him,
officially
but
say
even he's
never go
been
to the
like, look,
Novus Ordo. Yeah, they
yeah.
officially say never go
Well,
to the
so
Novus Ordo unless
they're,
it's like a wedding or
yeah,
a funeral. Yeah.
yeah. Their argument is that, if you know what they're you have the, you follow their line of reasoning, which is that the Novus Ordo in most forms that it's found can be damaging to understanding of the Catholic faith, and also like a lex orandi, lex credendi argument, right? And
Hmm.
so they're saying, if you know better, why would you ever subject yourself to that? So I can see that, like, from that perspective, it makes sense. But is it always doable? No. Most of
Hmm.
the society priests I've interacted with probably wouldn't like beat you over the head or like be really upset if you say, like, okay, I went to the Novus Ordo with my folks, or like I
Sure.
went there for, or if you avail yourself to the sacraments from like a Novus Ordo priest, they're not
Hmm.
gonna be like, what are you doing? Like,
Yeah.
especially in
No.
countries where it's just, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. If you want
No,
to jump
I've
in, I'm
heard.
sorry.
So I don't have any personal experience with the SSPX. I've never attended.
Oh,
I do know a few people who are former attendees, and I've gotten a wide range of views. Some of them where the priest would actually be kind of chill about it. Other cases where
yeah,
the priest would be like kind of upset, or even if you say like FSSP, they'd almost get like upset, like you're betraying them. So I
yeah,
understand that there's a bit of a range based on who you're talking to and whatever. Um, it's good. It seems like we have some common ground because I was trying to point to like the official, like what's on their website.
yeah. I
The
know
hardline
they
stance
take a
they're taking.
very
Yeah.
strong
So it
stance
sounds
against
like
it.
you
Yeah.
don't quite take that, which I think is good for common ground. I want to see maybe where we disagree. Um, what is the strongest language you would use against the Novus Ordo? Maybe that'll help me. Like how like
Yeah,
because one of the
so
things I've heard are
yeah,
like sacrilegious, offensive to God, doesn't isn't Catholic or something like that. Like how far would you go?
mhm. Yeah, the one thing I've read a lot, and this is, it's not just, you have to remember the society is kind of like the foremost
Hmm.
in the trad sphere, just because they've been around the longest, right? I mean, the Society Seminary in Acon, it predates, the consecrations in '88, and when Lefebvre kind of
Hmm.
became this, like, you know, everyone knew who he was at that point, even if you weren't in that sphere or not. They were kind of that vanguard for quite some time,
Hmm.
but the main thing I would agree with is there definitely was, specifically in regards to the implementation of the new mass, how it actually was formed, right? And this is something that Peter Kay writes a lot about. This is something that's brought
Hmm.
up by pretty much anyone in the trad sphere, is that for the first time in history, you have a, pretty much a huge reform to the rite of mass and the Roman rite specifically. And it was done not in an organic fashion, and relegated to a committee that, obviously, I were they acting in good faith? I don't know. I wasn't there. Right. Some would, point to writings of
Hmm.
Bugnini and stuff and be like, this guy was like
Right. Right.
Masonic. I don't know. That's just like papal, well, not, well, Vatican intrigue, which, Vatican intrigue has been like a topic of news and writers for centuries. Right. But we do
Hmm.
know that prior to this, there really hadn't been a formation of the rite in this manner ever before.
Mhm.
When Pius
Probably the
V,
biggest change between two consecutive missals. I mean, I think that's pretty fair to say. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, and
Mhm.
I mean, even prior to that, Pius XII takes granted how much he was actually making that decision due to his advanced age.
Mhm.
The changes to the Holy Week, right?
Right. Right.
55,
Mhm.
and that was kind of the let's see if this can be done, and
Mhm.
they kind of opened the door, and then next thing you know, you have the document Sacrosanctum Concilium, and then you have the Concilium being made from that working document, and then you have for
Mhm.
the first time like a workshop on the liturgy. Um,
Mhm.
so there's a huge. My biggest argument there is that there is a breach from the organically developed liturgy, which
Mhm.
was like a living, breathing tradition. I know there's the argument. Well, Pius V, he codified the mass. He didn't make that on his own. There was no
Mhm.
committee that made that. That was like this is the common Roman rite as it's found pretty much
Mhm.
everywhere in the Western world, outside of
Yep.
a
Yep.
few like smaller rites, which really in content and to any layman viewing them probably wouldn't be able to figure out the difference between the Ambrosian rite or like the
Mhm.
Ceremus or the
Yeah.
Latin,
Yeah.
the Tridentine Mass as we know it. He was just
Mhm.
codifying what already existed. This for the first time was here's some things we want. Okay, we want a little more vernacular. We want some more
Mhm.
participation of the laity. Things that on the face of it aren't like bad, but
Yeah. Yeah.
let's leave it up to a committee. And then on that
Yeah.
committee, there we know this for a fact. Like this isn't like some Vatican intrigue. There were individuals who were non-Catholic
Mhm.
on that advisory board, which really makes you question, like, okay, the validity of the mass, as long as the matter, form, and intent, if I'm to remember correctly, is there. You can valid Eucharist, is occurring,
Mhm.
transubstantiation is occurring. That's not what we're arguing about, right? Because obviously,
Mhm.
you can go to an Orthodox liturgy, and
Right.
obviously
Yeah.
there's a lot of reasons why you shouldn't go to that, but validity is a very low bar. And so, yeah, the validity is not in question, but because it is this huge change, some would say a breach from the organic tree of liturgy that had developed
Mhm.
over about 1500 years organically, that the Catholic like actual character of the mass is called into question. So that's
Sure.
what
Sure.
I would definitely agree with, and I know that some
Mhm.
society writers have also taken that line.
Right. Yeah. So I think again we can find some more common ground in the sense that yeah, the amount of change that happened, the fact that it was done basically overnight, and then it was also not really implemented well. Because if you look at what Mass looked like right after it was implemented, it doesn't look like
Yeah,
Sacrosanctum Concilium, right? Um,
no.
so this would maybe be my next question. When you actually look at the text of the Mass of Paul VI, would you say there's anything problematic in there, or would you just say it's not as good?
Definitely not as good. In terms of problematic, right? Like it's if you were to be given a car and you started driving down the road, but then you notice there was a lot of things missing that weren't there, that you expect to be
Mhm.
there, that you rely on. There's a problem, right? It's still a car, but there's a lot that's missing. There's a lot that's gone.
Mhm.
That's not a good thing, right?
Mhm.
So just because in the wording of the mass itself, okay, there might be nothing that's a huge impediment to the faithful,
Mhm.
right? But in regards to what was lost, what was taken away, and also what the emphasis of the mass is, there's a lot more
Mhm.
language that's changed towards viewing it as like a community, social, gathering with a worship element, but not focusing on the sacrifice of
Mhm.
Calvary as the focal and main point of the mass. There definitely is a change in the language there, which, if it was for anything else, wouldn't be a big deal. But because it is the mass, the source and summit kind of the Catholic faith and our, deepest
Mhm.
expression of it, it is a big deal. Any change you make is a big
Mhm.
deal. So, yeah, that's my take on it. I know others have,
Mhm.
written a little bit more at length on that, but there's just so many things that were lost. The last gospel, right, kind of being this really
Mhm.
graceful exit, from the mess. And someone that attends as well, you're very familiar, right? All of a sudden, we're
Mhm.
we're standing back up. It's another gospel reading, and first chapter of John. Uh, but in addition to that, part of the things about the big thing about the Novus Ordo, with that minimization of what once was and just complete modification and something just not being there
Mhm.
at all, is also the amount of leeway that's given to the individual celebrant and how the mass actually is exhibited. And this
Mhm.
is what opened the door to, I mean, we've all probably seen compilations and clips and videos of crazy
Mhm.
things going on in the worship space that shouldn't be going on. Things that would be very, very difficult by the rubrics of, the Old Mass, even the
Mhm.
62 Missal, right? Like there is so much in there that's outlined. Whereas with the new Mass, okay, you have the prayers, but it straight up also says in like the working documents and rubrics, like, you have a certain amount of leeway. You can pick which Eucharistic prayer you want. Like you can just, pick and choose how you want the canon to be on a particular Sunday. Granted, I understand Eucharistic prayer 1 is the, original prayer, but it's like
Mhm.
to have like like a choice of options almost implies
Mhm.
that there was like a deficiency with just the one. right? Right. So I would say
Mhm.
so. And because like Eucharistic prayer 1 is, it's great because that's what it was.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
always, the
Mhm.
canon of Mass, and the canon of Mass is something that always, that's like really, really where things really crystallize kind of early on, is the canon.
Mhm.
Mass of the catechumens, obviously there have been a bit of change over time, but
Mhm.
yeah, the canon, especially the prayers of the canon, those remaining in
Yeah.
their form, some of the most basic parts of liturgy, and the fact that all of a sudden, hey, you can do this, you can do that. And we all saw this with, kind of how that was expressed in the architecture of the
Mhm.
churches, and how going to one church down the street, you're going to get a different liturgy than the other church across town. I think a lot of us have
Mhm.
seen that in our lifetime. So that was a little long, but yeah,
Yeah, no, I got
that's
you.
my view on it.
Yeah. Yeah, again, a lot of common ground. I think it's interesting things like I believe the germ actually says you're supposed to use Eucharistic prayer 1 on Sunday. So like a lot of priests just don't do that for whatever reason. And I think that's interesting. Yeah, so the question is more of like a philosophical of like, okay, is more better? Like probably, right? I mean, the last gospel is a good example. Like, okay, we got rid of that. Um, of course, the last gospel was something that started out as a private devotion, right? The priest would go back into can't remember what it's called. What is it called behind the altar?
Sacristy.
Sacristy. He would go
Yep.
back there, and that's like a private devotion he would do. Either it was that or it was the prayers at the foot of the altar. I can't remember which one of those was something that the priest did, and then it kind of became just like a part of the mass, right? Organically, and of course with approval and everything. Um,
Yeah.
but to say that, like, okay, if we remove that, okay, I guess you're missing out on that. All else being equal, is that better or worse? Like, I think there's almost an issue with that, because you could say that about like, actually a great example would be like the Luminous Mysteries, right? It's like, okay, Luminous Mysteries is a private devotion, and a lot of trads don't pray the Luminous Mysteries, which I think is fine if you don't want to. But
Yeah.
I don't think it's like, oh, you're missing out on this, so now you're like your soul is kind of in danger by not praying these mysteries. Like, no, I don't think necessarily that's true. Like, grace is not like a math equation in that sense, right?
Yeah, I can see that, but the main thing is just like the fact that the modification happened, right?
Mm-hmm.
We can talk all day long about how certain things were added into, the liturgy. I mean, we can talk about how, the change between leavened and unleavened bread. We don't really know when that change occurred, because obviously the East, they still
Yeah, yeah.
use leavened bread, right, in
Mm-hmm.
their liturgy, and that's fine. But we don't really know why the West, went to unleavened bread. There's a lot of theories about it, but one thing we do know is that this kind of just organically developed, and
Mm-hmm.
that was what really, that was like a kind of the normative force in the creation of the liturgy, was,
Mm-hmm.
how long had this tradition persisted? Is it right, is it fitting? And if it isn't, then it's
Mm-hmm.
fine, right? But there is the fact that we went from the very earliest of Christian liturgies in the
Mm-hmm.
catacombs, right? And this
Yeah, yeah.
developed into, what we see, you know at least in the old mass, by 1955, before they really started doing some outside changes in there. When we start kind of saying like, okay, like, is there more graces? Is it more fitting? I think there's a lot to
Mm-hmm.
be said about, you might receive more graces from the TLM. And here's the thing, right? It isn't, yeah, like you said, it isn't a math equation, but we definitely want people to have a better understanding when they go to the liturgy in regards to
Mm-hmm.
what's important.
Mm-hmm.
And this gets a little anecdotal, at least on my side, but the
Mm-hmm.
amount of like, I actually have a pretty good number of Protestant friends, and I've been able to just kind of have them come to Latin Mass with me. And the one thing that is very striking to them is the Eucharist in that, when they go, which is something that you just can't deny, right? When
Mm-hmm.
you go to the old Mass versus, sometimes you can go to a new and it's very clear, but not always. Unfortunately, maybe it's more common. It's not always. That's, at least in my
Mm-hmm.
experience, unfortunately, right?
Yeah, sure.
And going just back to lex orandi, lex credendi, yeah, it seems like the refrain of most trads, but I do think it's because it just is such a clear crystallization of why we think there is a lot of deficiencies and problems with the new mass, because it's not always there. And when it has to be done, when the new mass is reverent, when it's good and beneficial, it's almost always when they're incorporating elements that are just standard in the old mass, right?
Mhm.
And that's where it gets a little like, okay, like you start to question, the
Mhm.
changes as they're brought on. Again, it's not a matter of validity, right? We've already established that.
Mhm.
It's just a matter of like what's more fitting, what can be more efficacious, and definitely what gets across the message of the Eucharist is the source and summit
Yeah.
of the
Mhm.
Mass.
Yeah, and those liturgies that people always point to, like these are the Rev Novus Orders. Yeah, it looks almost. I mean, it does look a lot like a Latin Mass, but also it
Yeah.
looks a lot like what Sacrosanctum Concilium called for, right? So it, that perfectly makes sense, right? That yeah, it's not going to be exactly the same, but it is going to be pretty similar because at least when you read that text plainly, it's not really calling for too many changes. Um, here's maybe a kind of a thought experiment. So liturgy kind of develops organically, private devotions become part of the mass. You can imagine like an alternate universe where like we keep adding things, all good things, right? Like, adding prayers at the foot of the altar, adding the last gospel, like all these, potentially other things you could add. And then you've got like a 3 hour long liturgy, right? And the church is like, all
Mm.
right, maybe we need to simplify this a little bit. Now, whether you think they took too many things out or they did it imprudently, did it too quickly, I think that's totally fair to talk about. But I think the essential idea of simplifying the mass is not necessarily problematic, and it's also not unprecedented, right? If you look at a low mass in a way is a simplified form of the high mass, right? And then the Holy Week change in 1955, kind of simplifying what is a the liturgies are very long, so like there's a sense of like, okay, we've got to pull it back a little bit. And yes, it can seem like we're taking out things that are good and like therefore we're making it bad. I don't think that's necessarily the case. I think pulling back and simplifying can be a good thing. Personally, I think having the option to go to the longer mass, like the more ornate mass, should always be an option. I don't think it should have ever been taken away. But I think for a lot of people, having a simplified version could be a good thing.
So my contention with that argument is that historically, one of the reasons why there was, at least in the council, from my readings, is they wanted to have a change was there actually was low masses were pretty common
Hmm.
prior to I mean
Yeah, I've
what we
heard that. Yeah.
prior to what we see today. Low masses were pretty common, so a lot of people were very used to the low mass. Sung masses were kind of reserved for feast days, other days, Holy Week,
Hmm.
right? And obviously, some special occasions like weddings and such, if they could spare the
Hmm.
singers, and not every church had enough to have a quorum for a choir. And so there was this idea that the mass was kind of already too simple, right? Which is
Hmm.
kind of, I know it sounds weird to
Hmm.
our modern ears, but there kind
Yeah.
of was that idea at the time, which, if you're reading your missal, it seems very difficult to ever think that. But for a lot of people growing up, especially if they're poorly catechized or if they just, were kind of going with the flow, to them, the mass was something that, the priest was just kind of did his own thing. If you were an altar server, right? If you served during the low mass, you only there's like two jobs you could do, right? So there already
Hmm.
kind of was this idea that the mass is kind of simple. The sung masses were not seen too often, and people weren't really following along with the missals in certain areas. And there was this idea already that the mass was simplified. In
Hmm.
regards to like length of mass or how organic development would continue, um, I think that what we've seen, right, with organic development and how it's always been like shown and explained, and I think this kind of just goes with our development of doctrine, things of that nature too in the church. It all kind of fits and follows the same pattern. So there's a lot of change starting out in the beginning when the liturgy started, right? Like an acorn and an oak tree, they they're the same thing, right? Obviously,
Hmm.
just at different stages in their development. The oak tree is good. That change from the acorn to the oak, at first is dramatic, incredibly dramatic.
Hmm.
But once the oak kind of reaches its like full extent, it's gonna start like pretty much maturing and settling in. Like, okay, a few branches might come out here, maybe a new leaf, a new feast day comes in, right?
Mhm.
This is not my own idea. Don't think I'm eloquent at all. This is Dr. Peter Kay's words,
Mhm.
right? And so I think that fear is a little bit, unjustified, because as we've seen, the liturgy, really, you would be able to recognize a Catholic liturgy if you were back in, let's say, like the 14th century. You would know you're at a Catholic mass. Now, granted, there
Mhm.
definitely was some differences. Don't get me wrong. There was
Sure,
some
sure.
differences, right? But a lot of those same elements are still there, and you'd know you're at a Catholic mass. And same thing applied, I'd say, all the way up into, the mid 60s. There was no chance of you walking into a Catholic mass versus a Protestant service and getting too confused, right?
Mhm.
At the very least, if you went to like a high church Anglican or Episcopalian church, like, you're not at a Catholic mass because they're speaking English
Mhm.
and using the Book of Common Prayer, even if it does
Mhm.
look pretty similar, right?
Mhm.
So when it comes to like it getting like really crazy, if organic development were to just run wild, I'd say that's a little bit of unearned fear. And if you really want to get into it on that front, on like length of masses, I mean, talk to a member of any of the Eastern churches what like Easter's like for them.
Mhm.
It's crazy. It's super long. I mean, some of the liturgies of St. John Chrysostom can go on for a very, very long time. And this is like, they have experienced even less change. If you want an example of organic development of the liturgy, I'd say the Eastern churches and the liturgy of St. John Chrysostom, which is also a rite in,
Mhm.
our Catholic Church as well. They obviously, in some of the churches, they incorporate more vernacular, but still a lot of it is, whichever variant of the Byzantine rite they're in, or other Eastern churches that fall under the Roman purview. There's still, they haven't added a lot since the 60s. A lot of it hasn't
Mhm.
changed. A lot of the Orthodox and the Eastern churches, they pride themselves on the fact that this is just the same liturgy. It's the liturgy of St. John Chrysostom. This isn't going to change, right? And that's
Mhm.
because it has matured. It has reached that point where it's kind of at that final stage of development. It's still living. It's still breathing. Don't get me wrong. They have new devotions and
Mhm.
things of that nature, but that liturgy has matured.
Mhm.
So yeah, I know that was also, didn't want to talk too
Yeah.
long there.
No, I gotcha. So you don't have a problem in principle of, like, for example, if all Vatican II did was make the readings in the vernacular, like a small change like that, because they sensed that people weren't, nobody was using their missals, they were just praying the rosary, and they didn't even know what the readings were that day, and they, you know,
Mhm.
that was their decision. Like, you're not necessarily against something like that if it's done. It's just the
Yeah,
amount that was done so quickly is kind of your issue.
yeah, and also too, well, it's the amount, and then also too what they allowed after, right? Because like I said, a big part of what makes the Novus Order different is just the lack of uniformity that it kind of brought about, because there was so much that was
Mhm.
left up to the individual celebrant. And in regards to the vernacular, it's really interesting, and to kind of, we're talking about this in the lens of the society, so this also fits. I mean, there's some like, Lefebvre went on record saying, like, if it was just the vernacular to the mass, like, that would not have been that big of a deal.
Hmm. Nice.
Like, if it was just the matter of language, it would not have been. And people are like, Lefebvre said that? Like, yeah, he actually did. He wasn't
That's
too
pretty cool.
like, he didn't have a huge problem. Yeah, he didn't have a huge problem with the idea of the vernacular, because obviously people pray in their own languages. It's no problem. But if that were the only change, as much as I do think there's a good argument
Mhm.
that Latin should be retained for the most part of the
Mhm.
liturgy, because it is such an integral part of the Roman Rite,
Mhm.
and is definitely like the signifier of that. And of course, it's just
Mhm.
such a huge part of our tradition and like, and in history.
Yeah.
Um, when it if it was just down to that, it wouldn't be that big a
Mhm.
deal. And I mean, you even see this in society chapels or fraternity, parishes, or any other Ecclesia Dei community, right? Um, the homily has always been, this is when the priest can say what he wants, right? This is
Right. Yeah.
kind of, the homily is kind of a step outside of the liturgy, you know, um,
Mhm.
and everyone sits down. It does the, usually at the Latin mass churches, he does the announcements too. This is the priest's time to speak on things that he wishes to speak about. Usually that includes a sermon. So and that has in practice also allowed the priest to reread the readings in the vernacular,
Right. Of course. Yeah. Yeah.
right? So I mean,
Mhm.
and that never was necessarily banned. That wasn't like against the rubrics, as it were, because the homily was always the priest's time. So even if
Mhm.
like a change as as you posited there, where okay, we'll do the readings of vernacular. Well, that never necessarily was barred. If the council, if Second Concilium and how it was implemented was more like, okay, here's a few things that priests should try to emphasize, right? Okay, maybe
Hmm.
some of the hymns, have more hymns in the vernacular, right? Have we recommend that the priest, say the readings in the
Hmm.
vernacular, during his time, for the sermon. Once
Hmm.
again, for the edification of the faithful. I guess that's probably how the terms would go, right?
Hmm.
I mean, that's not really a big change, and
Yeah.
it's always been that priests have they speak from the pulpit more than just at mass as well.
Hmm.
So, and this is also kind of where we get into the whole argument of why they wanted to add more of the, of the scripture with the 3-year cycle
Hmm.
than in the 1-year cycle. There's this idea, oh, well, we can also get Bible study and education as part of the mass. Well, like, look, the mass does educate. Don't get me wrong, but like if you're just getting the readings from mass, you're not really going to get a huge good understanding of scripture because okay, every Sunday, yeah, okay, you get a little bit of the gospel. In the new mass, you
Hmm.
get, 2 readings now. Oh wow. Right. In addition to the gospel. But like obviously you need a bit more there. And it never was the idea that we're gonna educate people on scripture just from the liturgy alone. The liturgy
Hmm.
and the scriptures that are part of that all point to, usually the greater truths behind the liturgy, also what feast days are being celebrated, and the like.
Hmm.
So uh, that was also kind of long as well. But
Yeah.
yeah, no, the
Well, that's
vernacular
good.
is a very small portion of the change, and if it was just the vernacular,
Yeah.
the change
No.
would not have been that drastic.
Yeah, and that's what I hear from pretty much everyone is like they're not even necessarily that's not the hill they're going to die on. I mean, obviously they like it, and Gregorian chant in Latin versus English it does just kind of sound better in Latin. I'll fully admit that. Yeah, I do think I like the idea of the parts of the mass that change should be done in English potentially. Like you can argue either way. And the parts that are the same every time should be done in Latin because we know what we're saying, right?
Mhm.
And I think and it is good, every TLM I go to, at least if it's on a Sunday, the priest does always read in English before the homily, which is great. Um, there are also the other parts of the mass that change every time. That maybe if you don't have a missal, you're not going to hear it, right? You talk about the feast day, right? Well, if you didn't have a missal and you
Mhm.
weren't paying attention, you wouldn't know what feast day it is, right? Um, which of course can all be solved if you're paying attention, right? But I think yeah, the vernacular versus the Latin, it doesn't seem like that's really the issue. So, what would you like if you could point to one thing or maybe a couple things that you think really are the worst changes? What would you point to?
Definitely, the modifications to the canon, um, also to just the fact that there is so much leeway given to the celebrant and how it is celebrated. And
Hmm.
that's like the lack of uniformity within the liturgy that was introduced. And yeah, granted, there's abuses, and abuses can always happen. Even in an old mass, it
Hmm.
can happen. It's a lot more difficult because it's so clearly outlined what the priest
Hmm.
says and does, right? I
Unless
mean,
you
I guess
really
it's
know
probably
Latin, it's hard to ad lib, right?
yeah, it's very. I mean, I guess the worst abuse I might have ever seen at like Latin mass is just sometimes you can hear a priest and like their pronunciation is atrocious, right?
Yeah,
Granted, that doesn't change the efficacy of anything going
yeah,
on, but
sure, sure,
yeah, sometimes the Latin pronunciation is just really bad. But that's like the worst I've ever seen, right? Meanwhile, in
yeah,
the new mass, with the emphasis being changed, right? The emphasis being changed from the sacrifice at Calvary. There's so many like propitiatory prayers that were removed. Parts of things like the prayers of the foot of the altar, right? There's this idea like even the priest has to prepare himself. This guy's ordained, and he's still saying like, "Hey, like God, please prepare my soul that I'm worthy enough just to enter up to the altar today," right? And
hmm,
this happens at every mass, right? Things like that are gone. Obviously, the allowance for the versus populum, right? That was changed in a big way. I mean, that's a. I know it's a seemingly a minor thing, but this
hmm,
does change, the laity's understanding of kind of what's going on, even if they can't necessarily hear everything, right? The liturgy is said, the people being there, it's for their benefit, to be there. And obviously, the church decrees, it's you need to be at the Sunday obligation and all the other days that
hmm,
are obligated by Holy Mother Church. But at the end of the day, like the priest can be up there, with servers or not, say the entire mass, and it's not dependent on anything that the laity has to do,
Hmm.
right? Meanwhile, it's very challenging for a priest to try to do the new mass without a congregation doing the responses. It's very awkward. I mean, this is like lots of priests have said this, right?
Sure, sure.
And there's a big, because they wanted this, we need the people involved, we need the people saying their responses. It removes this emphasis off of like, hey, this is something sacred going on. And I think it's no, it's no coincidence that things like communion in the hand started becoming commonplace because of this new understanding that in a big way came out of this new liturgy and how this new liturgy was being expressed in most places. I mean, if Paul VI had come out, or I guess at the time, because they it's the name keeps changing. The Congregation for the Doctrine of
Yeah,
Faith
sure,
came out
sure.
really hard and was like, "Hey, look, like
Mhm.
people are going off the rails. This is not what the concilium put out. Like this is, y'all are not following the rubrics. Like we need to have like an exploratory period to figure out what's going on." That never happened, right? What happened was, okay, we're now going to have indults for almost every Western country to allow communion in the hand. Every church is like getting reactivated. High altars
Mhm.
are going away. I mean, this is actually why the society never had any problems making their chapels with statuary and with altars, because so many churches were just throwing them away. So they were just buying
Hmm.
them for. This is like
Yeah,
you
yeah.
can, like, yeah, the society talks about a lot about this in their documentaries and books about their history. Like, hey,
Hmm.
we had no problem securing like stuff to make an altar, to make a chapel look like a Catholic church. There's no problems
Hmm.
because they're just getting rid of everything, right?
Sure, sure, sure.
So this new understanding and emphasis of the mass on we need the people participating, and this is like an integral part of the liturgy now. Whereas prior, like there could be this is I don't know who said this, but just one of the people in chat space, there could literally be a gunfight going on in the nave, and in the old mass, the priest is going to keep chugging along, like if he can, right? And it's
Yeah,
not.
yeah.
There's no need for the responses there. There's no need for. I mean, you see this so much in the new mass. Is the priest like is trying to get engagement from the laity, like from the congregation, like I
Oh,
need
yeah,
you to
yeah,
say amen. I need you to like. It's like you don't. It's
yeah.
just this is
So
that's
yeah,
not
it's
the
interesting.
focus of the mass.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I like going to low mass. I always bring my missal, and I like reading along with
Mm-hmm.
what the priest is doing.
Yeah.
Um, that's great. I do think, from what I've heard, there wasn't a lot of issues with people not really doing that. So prior to the changes, right? They would, again, the stereotype of just like praying the rosary and not having any idea what's going on, and then going for communion, coming
Mm.
back. Um, and yeah, maybe the church overcorrected in a sense, and now there's too much feeling of like, why do I feel like I'm participating, to a similar extent as like an altar server? Um, so I think that it's fair to like point out like, yeah, I don't really like that, or maybe it gives people the wrong impression, but I can see why the church saw a need for this kind of reform, because they saw people basically going to the other extreme of not participating at all. And of course, if nothing that we do in the pews actually changes anything in the mass, um, but I can see why that was something they noticed, right?
So I will say this, right? This is just a historical point, is that, the concern that the laity was not actively participating in the mass is a refrain that was not born at the council. This is something that Pius X was really big on, having people pray the
Mm.
mass. Um,
Yeah,
so
yeah.
I actually, until I unfortunately it was I lost it. My 1962 missal that I had for like 3 years, it was grimy and dirty. I had it for it gone to multiple countries with me and everything. Unfortunately, it was misplaced, ended up in a lost and found, and someone grabbed it, probably mistakenly. But if you open up
Mm.
the inside of the 62 missal that I think Angelus Press, that's actually the
Yeah,
society's
that's the
like
one I have. So yeah.
yeah, it works great.
Mm.
But in the opening like little page, that is like actually from Pope St. Pius X writing about how the laity should pray the mass, right?
Hmm.
So this was a refrain. People like had this concern. Um, the thing is, it'd be really hard to tell because I don't really know if you could really get metrics for this, but I would go so far as to say I don't really know if changing the liturgy made people actually like care about it more or less if they already didn't, right? Because at
Sure.
least in my experience growing up, and I grew up in the new mass too, man. That was all I had around here. I'm from
Hmm.
the South, still live in the
Hmm.
South. I live in Virginia. My viewers know that, and it was like it was a dwindling cohort of people my age,
Mhm.
and I don't think the mass
Yeah.
was something they were paying attention to, even if it was in their language, right?
Mhm.
So
Yeah.
it's okay. That might have been the reason why, but okay, in practice, that didn't change anything. And
Mhm.
now, with the mass vernacularization, as I mentioned, it's not the worst thing that changed,
Mhm.
but uh, what makes it different than the Protestant service down the street? Okay, obviously validity. Well, if someone is so badly formed in the faith that they don't even really have an understanding of the true presence, which according to Pew Research in 2019, still a lot of American Catholics and
Mhm.
just don't have an understanding of the true presence, right? How are they supposed to realize that no, you need to stay in the Catholic Church when their
Mhm.
liturgy outwardly doesn't look much different than what the Episcopalians are doing right down the road? And the Episcopalians, they're much cooler. They're not going to yell at you for using contraception, right?
Mhm.
This is it gets into a larger cultural zeitgeist,
Yeah.
but like that when we started making some of these changes to fix these problems, when it really isn't going to change the root of the problem itself. I mean,
Sure,
then
sure.
it's what really suffers is just the liturgy.
Yeah, and I think this is a point kind of to your in agreement is the church can make decisions that prudentially end up not being great decisions. Discipline,
Yeah.
whether it's disciplinary or liturgically. Yeah, like changing the mass to have more participation might have backfired, and I'm totally open to like that being. I don't think doing that makes a schismatic or anything like that. Um, I think there's much room to talk about that, and then there's talk about why don't we have another council and kind of correct back. Um, but it sounds like most of what I'm hearing from you is these sort of practical elements versus the SSPX, where they kind of just on principle say like, no, this mass is evil or this is sacrilegious. Um, whereas it sounds like you're kind of just saying like, prudentially, this was a bad idea. Like we shouldn't have done this.
Well, prudentially, it was a bad idea. You could, so obviously with the society, a lot of what their language says is that it has a Protestant spirit to it. That's a
Mm-hmm.
big part of the literature I've read. It's something that Lefebvre talked a lot about. Was there is a Protestant
Yeah,
spirit
I've heard
infused in the
that. Yeah.
mass, and also a spirit of modernism. Again, this goes back to the fact that there was such an advocacy for such a change, and the changes that came out of it were so drastic, right? The idea
Mm-hmm.
that something that had organically developed for the better part of 1500 years needed to be updated to suit the whims or needs of modern man, is an idea that I think there is a pretty good amount of, yeah, evidence that you could argue is a very modern idea. There's the idea of the aggiornamento that there needs to be an updating, a catching up, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
And this is what the society takes a huge problem with, right? That,
Mm-hmm.
and it's not just the liturgy that you see this. You also see this with, I mean, the society, obviously the liturgy is like the focal point for them because they were, for a
Mm-hmm.
time prior to the Ecclesia Dei Commission getting set up, and also prior to Summorum Pontificum in 2007, they
Mm-hmm.
were the premier, outside of a few indult masses here and there. They were the premier source of being able to attend the traditional liturgy
Mm-hmm.
anywhere. So that's obviously been their focal point, but they also talk a lot about some of the other documents in the council. Nostra Aetate probably
Right.
being
Yeah.
the biggest one, right? That they
Okay.
think like, okay, there's some language here that definitely they wouldn't say, so maybe some individual priests and some others in the society would say it's heretical. That's obviously a really big charge, but what they would say is that there is opening the door, and it's very easy for this to be viewed in a heretical sense because they have just a very,
Mm-hmm.
very heavy stance just against the spirit of the council as a whole, right?
Mm-hmm.
Not the idea of councils, right?
Right.
Obviously,
Of course. Yeah.
councils are a thing that have been happening forever, but a lot of the language and I mean, obviously Lefebvre was there, so that also sets a
And
lot
he
of
signed the
their tone
documents,
in
right?
regard. He did sign the documents, but he also, I think, was sending up the most like, hey, we need to change. Things might have been even like crazier without his interventions. He does write his book, I Accuse the Council. He kind of outlines actually in black and white all the times he had to send back up for review, like, hey, we need to make this more clear. This, like, pretty much everything he was saying was, this document needs more clarification. This document needs more clarification. That was like, it's like a whole book of him just saying
Mm-hmm.
like, this is, I was a working draft I got, and I need to send this up again, which was there needs to be more clarification on this point. So that's really where the society kind of draws the line, and that's why they take a very hard stance against the liturgy, because it is born out of that spirit, as they argue. I
Hmm.
agree with a good portion of their concerns, right? They obviously take a pretty heavy stance language wise against going to the new mass. I can say all day long. Look, I'm not gonna like beat on someone if they go to the Novus Ordo, because we live in a godless time. Going to a religious, going to mass, Novus Ordo or not, it's so much better than what most people are doing, right? It's I can't be too upset, but at the same time, I
Hmm.
drive over an hour to go to a liturgy, right? I obviously think there's a lot of merit in going,
Sure.
because I
Yeah.
definitely don't like spending extra money on gas.
No one
What?
does.
Yeah.
Uh,
Um, but yeah, I think their language. There's a
mhm,
reason why I see where they're coming from,
mhm,
right? And their whole thing is that there's a crisis, and not just the fact that we had this council and it wasn't that good. Um, they obviously the entire linchpin of their argument is that the church is in a crisis, right?
mhm.
And this is what also leads to 88 at Econ,
Right.
right? This is kind of the society. If you want, in a nutshell, why the society has done anything, it's because they believe the church is in crisis. If you don't hold that view, then a lot of things society has done they become really, really hard to justify and understand.
Mhm,
If you understand that view, or you hold that view yourself, then it makes a lot more sense, and you can see why they did the things they did.
mhm.
I think in a nutshell, that is the linchpin of the society for their argument.
That's great. That's a great point. And yeah, I definitely in a future, if you want to do it, we should talk about the, I guess, canonical status. Whether they're in schism and supply jurisdiction, all that. Because I think that's all interesting. But it
Oh yeah.
is, yeah. I am curious though, because so for the listeners, one of the other topics we wanted to talk about was Vatican II.
Mhm.
And again, it sounds like maybe we have more common ground than I thought, because it sounds like, again, this society probably takes a harder stance than you do. They might actually point to phrase and be like, this phrase is not only ambiguous, but actually like wrong and we need to change it. Versus you're kind of just saying like, this could be very easily misinterpreted and it's causing a lot of confusion.
Yeah, I
Is that,
mean,
is that
so
fair?
so that for the most part, that's true. The society put out a little pamphlet called "Time Bombs of the Vatican II, or the Second Vatican Council." I think it might just be shortened to Vatican II for printing, but literally like a dollar. It's like $1 on their website. It's one of the cheapest things on Angelus Press. So I picked one up, and it
Sorry,
pretty
wait, what was that
much
called again?
time bombs of the Second Vatican Council, or just time bombs of Vatican II. Like I said, I
Okay,
think
yeah,
it's just it's the same title really. Um, but
cool.
if anyone wants to just kind of see the society's argument, right, and like look, I don't think, if you're not a supporter of the society, I don't it's not going to like probably turn you into a supporter by reading it. And if you're
Sure,
for
sure.
them, it's not going to like change. It's just it's a very, very simple to read, short, clear, concise little pamphlet on the very specific lines of certain documents in the council that they take issue with. And so at first they kind of go, it starts from like, in their mind, from least worst to worst, right? So they kind of work their way up.
Mhm,
At first, they're like, okay, this language is very bad. A lot of their arguments are like, this language is novel. Like, this is language that we just have not really seen in the church's history. The refrain that the society uses a lot is that we're just teaching and transmitting the faith as it has always been taught and transmitted,
mhm,
right? Which makes it's a I mean, it's hard to argue with that, right? If they're just like, hey, this is what I'm using, because it's not it's, Vatican II didn't anathemize, Trent, it didn't anathemize
mhm,
Vatican I, didn't anathemize, all the other things other popes had said. Um, so it's a pretty strong refrain in a lot of cases. But
mhm,
they talk about some of this language, especially when it comes to like the idea of like religious freedom. The
mhm,
church, and as far as I'm aware, it does kind of track. The church in the past was always like, look, we believe in religious tolerance because we don't believe like just outright hurting or killing people that don't believe. It doesn't make much sense when we're a missionary church, following the great commission of
mhm,
Christ, right, in the gospel, to go and convert all nations.
mhm,
Killing them, we can't convert them, right? But
mhm,
there always was the idea, written and in practice, that if someone is spreading heretical ideas or just ideas contrary to the faith in a public setting, a civil government, or even when the papal states still were a thing, a temporal government actually has the right to kind of restrict someone's ability to do so, because even temporal governments are still like bound to truth, which would imply
Hmm.
the one truth of the fullness of the Christian faith being found in Catholicism. So for all of a sudden you have a document coming out of the council saying like, look, religious freedom is should be completely like safeguarded and protected. That's a very novel. That's very novel, right?
Hmm.
Um, Now, granted, there's also been a lot of talk, and the society talks about, and other talking heads have mentioned, well, you know Vatican II was more of a teaching council. It wasn't invoking the powers of the magisterium. That's, I don't know if that's really a strong argument, but what we're
Yeah, I'm
seeing.
not very convinced by
Yeah,
that. If you read Paul the
yeah.
Sixth, like the closing letter, it's pretty clear that he thinks
Oh
this is
yeah,
like
he's very
legit.
clear.
Yeah,
Yeah, he
yeah.
thinks it's legit, but he did say that nothing new was transmitted, right?
Hmm.
He said like the council has, if I remember the verbiage correctly, the council has refrained from making any great pronouncements on doctrine, something to that effect, where he was like, look, like
Hmm.
nothing really crazy new came out of this. I think the society would definitely argue otherwise, right? That there is some
Sure.
language that just is not found. And I,
Hmm.
I mean, look, I would love if anyone has out there, like, hey, look, like this church father or this previous pope was saying like religious freedom is fine, um, and I mean that in like a very like I don't know, post enlightenment sense, right? Like religious freedom,
Hmm.
like every state should have a First Amendment like the United States, and no state should ever make a law concerning like establishing Catholicism or any faith as like the one faith, right?
Hmm.
I mean, I'd like to see that. I do think that there's like
Sure.
definitely some questions that are raised. That pamphlet is like their most concise one talking about it. If you want probably like a longer explanation, um, they have uncrowned him is probably like, that's like Lefebvre's like main opus. Yeah, what
Hmm.
was it? What's the word? Magnum opus, right? That's what.
Magnum. Yeah, yeah.
That's his. Yeah, that's like if you want like a long, drawn out, eloquent argument, go read. Yeah, that work by Lefebvre. They have uncrowned him. If you want like, hey, what does the society think about the council documents? That little pamphlet would answer that. And yeah, they mostly bring that up. Also, the language of Nostra Aetate regarding other religions and like what truth is found in them. Um, you know,
Hmm.
uh, Again, this, where I'm coming from. I've already kind of made it clear as a support society, but these are, what's
Hmm.
interesting is the society was making arguments at the time in the mid 60s up into the 80s. In 86 you had the Assisi conference, right, which was also kind of a watershed moment for the society and trad movements as a whole, where you had this interfaith religious conference, the first of its kind of in Assisi, and there's some pretty crazy stuff that happened there. If anyone wants to look
Hmm.
into it, I don't think it's a coincidence that 2 years later, the consecrations at Cone happened either, right? Like so
Hmm.
quickly off the heels of that, even with Lefebvre's advanced age. But um, these questions that the society brought up are still being debated, right? Things
Hmm.
like, you know, I know there's some people think the Pachamama incident was just like actually just like some PR like conspiracy against the Pope. I don't know,
Hmm.
right? But things like that, definitely the Abu
Hmm.
Dhabi declaration, um, right? Things like these are still questions that the society brought up first, and are still being debated whenever the same new language that we really haven't seen is starts coming back up, right?
Hmm.
I mean, the Abu Dhabi declaration is, I mean, Lefebvre would be jumping up and down screaming, I was right, I was right, I was right, if
Hmm.
he was alive to see that, right? Because, you have at the time, our former pontiff, Francis, saying God wills a diversity of religions. Again, if someone can find verbiage like that ever, that God
Hmm.
wills people to be in error. I mean, unless we're looking at this from like a predestination like argument, which, I understand like there's an Augustinian way of looking at that, but like that's
Right, right.
very,
No, I think yeah, yeah. I got you.
yeah,
Of course, that's
yeah.
going a little bit outside of Vatican II, but I think yeah, if you wanted to, we could narrow in on something on Vatican. I guess the thing I
Yeah,
was coming at is I've heard a lot of people, like for example, like the statement about Muslims worshiping the same God, where they basically say like that's heresy, um, versus just something like, oh, this seems like a new understanding that is novel. The religious liberty one is not one I've looked
yeah.
into a whole lot myself. Um, but if you want to find something that we really disagree on, we could definitely poke in that. Um,
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, like, for me, I'd love for there to be like a clear cut, like, no, here's why it's orthodox, right? I'd love to, and
mm,
like I've yet to find like a convincing like kind of argument for some of these points that they brought up. And the
mhm,
reason I brought up the Abu Dhabi Declaration, not because I'm trying to like grandstand this too much, but more so because like this is the concern about the idea about like religious freedom, and religious liberty. This was a concern in the society, and Lefebvre kind of brings up first, and we're still having this like same conversation,
mhm,
like 60 years down the road. That's the reason I brought it up, because
sure.
it's like the same problem is exhibited there that the society would say was exhibited in some of these documents of the council.
Yeah, gotcha. No, that makes sense. Um, cool. I think we're getting close out of time here.
Yeah, I mean, look, I can go another 5 minutes. I just wanted to kind of set in
Yeah,
an earlier time if you wanted to, because I've been talking your ear off.
yeah, no, you're good.
you
Yeah, no,
know,
this was. I mean, I would say this went pretty well, like, especially considering I think probably more common ground than I was expect. I was just fully expecting like SSPX is right about everything, kind of thing. Uh, as far as their official stances, sounds like we're a
Mhm.
little bit closer than that, but probably still have obviously disagreements. Yeah, I'd love
Yeah, I
to
mean,
talk another
so I
time.
I agree with them a lot. Yeah, yeah, I agree with them a lot.
Mhm,
Um, like I said, like their status is irregular. That's my take on it, right? If we obviously, I think it would be a whole nother day if we wanted to get to are they in schism or not, because that's a hotly debated
mhm,
question. But no, like definitely, it is not a normal situation they are in via Rome, right?
sure. Yeah.
So, and I think anyone, society or not, should be praying for the regularization of relations
Mhm,
with the society in Rome, right? Now, granted, again, it all goes back to, is the church in
mhm,
crisis? They would say yes. And if the church is in crisis, as they would argue, then sometimes an extraordinary situation
mhm,
can call for extraordinary actions, right? I mean, that's the gist of the society's argument. We
mhm.
can talk about that and the pros and cons. I think that would be a
Yeah,
great episode to talk about.
I
And I
think
know you've definitely had, uh, yeah.
supply jurisdiction is something I find really fascinating. So we could definitely talk about how that applies or doesn't apply, because I think that's pretty
Mhm.
fascinating. Um, yeah, that'd be cool. We definitely would want to set up another time. This obviously went super well, I would say. I
Yeah,
was gonna ask if you want to plug. You already plugged at the beginning. What's next? What's
yeah. Well,
a video you're working on?
yeah, so I have no one's done it yet, but you're probably aware of the Tradcath beer, Tridentine Brewing. I don't know if you've
Yeah, yeah.
seen their stuff. Yeah, well, I don't live in Wisconsin, which is the only place in America. I mean, it makes sense. Like Wisconsin's like pretty much like Bavarian beer culture in the U.S. Right? Is Wisconsin.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah, yeah.
I don't live there, but I have a friend who does, and he finally sent me some. So there is a review coming for
Okay, cool.
Tridentine Brewing Company, and they're great people. So it's going to be kind of a funny one off. And then I have a few more pod appearances coming up. Should be interesting, and I'll be dropping those. But it's nice to not have to make a podcast episode for once and to just be a guest.
Yeah,
But yeah, I once again,
cool.
I really do appreciate you having me on, Seth. And no, I've seen your stuff for a while. I know we've kind of bantered a little bit on the
Yeah, yeah.
socials, but it's all because I think I think you make original stuff, which is why I like seeing. I like seeing new novel things in the sphere where we can talk.
There you go. I love it. All right, everyone, go check out Trad Tards on Instagram and YouTube, and
Mhm.
we'll see you guys next time.